So the old way of doing cybersecurity was to have solutions that protect infrastructure by stopping attackers from getting into our network. Now, times have changed, and as data and applications are moving beyond the traditional enterprise edge and into the cloud, we have to challenge our old assumptions about what makes an effective perimeter. There's now a proliferation of new approaches and new perimeters, and I think we have to really ask ourselves: Are these really new? Are these just more perimeters that we now have to defend, or is there a meaningful change that makes our jobs easier? This panel will discuss how we define, secure, and manage these new perimeters with these new approaches that are needed for the modern IT environment. I'm Sunil Yu. I'm the CISO in residence at YL Ventures and the former Chief Security Scientist at Bank of America. And I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. My distinguished guests who will be on my panel, I'll let them introduce themselves. And so I'll start with Adrian.
I'll keep it short. I'm Adrian Ludwig. I'm the CISO at Atlassian.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. And Philip?
I will do the same thing. I'm Philip Martin. I'm the CISO at Coinbase.
And last but not least, Udi.
You leave me no choice. Udi Mokadi, founder and CEO at CyberArk. Again, pleased to be here. We'd like to serve as an example of an Israeli company that went from startup nation to scale-up nation, and privileged access management is really our forte, and a pioneer and a leader in this field. Tell you more.
Great. Well, thanks, and thanks for being brief. We only have 25 minutes on this little panel, this short panel, so we'll hit the high points really quickly. So first of all, I mentioned at the outset of our session that there appears to be a proliferation of new perimeters. So let's first define what these perimeters are. Of course, we have the traditional network-centric perimeter, and now we're hearing that identity is the new perimeter. But I would argue that the network-centric perimeter was really essentially still an identity-centric perimeter where the identity is an IP address. When we talk about identity as a new perimeter, what exactly would you say here is new? And if there's nothing new, then is there something that's different? So Adrian, I'll start with you.
So we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and I had a pretty strong reaction to the word perimeter, and I think I still do. The notion of sort of a two-dimensional set of defenses, right, where something is inside and something is outside, makes sense if you only know about those two dimensions. But the reality has always been that there were a lot more dimensions that we had to worry about, right? So we have always had identity and the state of the device and whether there's malware on the device and, I don't know, 10 or 15 different things that in theory we were paying attention to. And yet somehow the security teams just had this on the network or I'm not on the network as the basis for decision making. So I think it's really just a case of our vocabulary is finally catching up with reality.
All right. How about you, Philip?
Yeah, I agree with that. I also had a pretty strong reaction to sort of the concept of a perimeter, especially in a world where, traditional perimeter concept, there's like an entryway, right, that you can strongly define, and that just doesn't hold in the world of sort of computer networks. I think what we're seeing here really, getting past my sort of reaction to the concept of perimeter, which we could probably debate like all day long, is really a redrawing of perimeters or borders that makes more sense, right? It's a little bit more nuanced in terms of what is inside a given perimeter, and it's being redrawn in sort of an application or data-centric way that I think makes a lot more sense in the context of a common network topology.
To follow Adrian, I think that there is a change in the vocabulary in the sense that everything is amplified now. So maybe we had it before, but we're here in times of COVID, and I think, and we work with a lot of large enterprises. For many of them, the work from home and sending employees home, for many of them, it was this question: oh my God, they're beyond the perimeter. And so that was the reference, the IP centric perimeter. So I think this new reality is amplified. There's much more use to and connections that go into the cloud environments. But I think, as we'll discuss, it also creates an opportunity to kind of sort it all out and pay attention to all of the moving parts.
Let's be a bit more precise, because I'm hearing a lot of different ways that you're characterizing what this perimeter is, or whether there's even a perimeter at all. at all. But I would still say there exists some kind of perimeter, and we have to be more precise in how we want to define what those different perimeters are. I think when we talk about identity-centric perimeters, oftentimes you think of user-centric identities. But I would argue there's also device-centric. Philip, you mentioned application-centric. Udi and Adrian mentioned data-centric. And I think even the network-centric perimeter is still applicable. Aren't those the different types of perimeters that we're having to deal with? I mean, these are all still perimeters.
I think that the issue is really that perimeter implies inside and outside. And that's an absolute boundary. And that's just not actually the case, right? I'll give you a specific example, right? If you have perimeter as your security control, then what are you doing about insider risk? Which is like year after year, the #1 thing that people are worried about, right? I guess you're just ignoring it. That doesn't seem like the right approach. And so I think what we're seeing is a sort of natural evolution of the understanding that there are a lot more than one boundary, and inside or outside is relative to a specific piece of data. Inside or outside is relative to a specific control at a given time. And so the simplification of perimeter is what's problematic. And so certainly introducing identity is critical. By identity, I mean like who is the person? Introducing machine variables, what is the operating environment that they're in? Network variables, what's the location? What's their current state is a big one. A huge amount of our investment in terms of defining our security controls has been around detection of automation, right? Somebody's credentials have been compromised and then they're being used in an automated way. Are they inside or outside of the perimeter? The automation of that is actually a thing that's sort of part of how we define our perimeter. And so I react a little bit sort of viscerally to the idea of constantly going back to inside or outside. I think you just have to be more dynamic about it. And it's a case where our metaphor is actually sort of contributing to one of the challenges.
I think that's exactly right. And I think it's a question of like how trustworthy, right? I don't think it's not a sharp delineation. You have or have not crossed this line. It's a spectrum, right? Like how well have you established your identity? How trustworthy? I mean identity in a very broad sense. How trustworthy are you compared to the enclave that you're trying to gain access to, and what its requirements for trustworthiness are? And I think that's really what we're seeing is a movement towards thinking in that kind of way, mostly forced, because we can't rely on the sort of the easy button of like, oh, I have a firewall and therefore I have a network perimeter anymore.
Yeah, I would say that the trustworthiness is the big topic, but many enterprises again have had that delineation. If they can only access this from the inside, and now we can apply different controls based on the different risks. I mean, there are some things that we can't get in the way or we don't want to get in the way, but we can, and there's some areas where we can put more controls. We were born in privileged access management where we said, control to the cloud console or control to the domain controller and other elements where it's a tier 0 asset, you want to put more controls. And define it based on the risk and the trustworthiness, I would say, of who's accessing.
On this topic of trustworthiness, that brings up the new approach that we hear about zero trust architectures and design principles. So how would you actually define trustworthiness? How would you determine a gradient of trustworthiness from essentially zero trust to something that is trustworthy enough to be able to grant access to some of your most sensitive assets? How do you determine that?
I think about this as like, how many lines of sight do I have on this identity? On this identity is such an overly defined word here. It's hard to use, but it's the only one that really works, right? But like, how many different validations do I have on this identity, right? So I grew up in sort of the U.S. government world, and I think about this a lot in terms of like security clearance process. It passed all the stupid paperwork and all that stuff, right? The underlying point there is getting as many different lines of confirmation into a person's identity and background as is possible, with the belief that an attacker is only able to spoof so many, right? And so the more you get, the more likely it is you'll be able to detect an inconsistency in a spoof. And I think the same model applies here.
So one would argue then that even a network-centric or network attributes still would be applicable in terms of being able to establish some level of trustworthiness, but we may choose to not assign it as much trustworthiness, let's say, as a device certificate. Or and I would actually divide up the whole notion of attributes to be those that are inherent to the asset and those that are behavioral. So you have things that are very descriptive of the asset and the things that are tied to the current or past behavior of a given asset, whether that's a person or a machine or an application.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. You have a set of attributes that you've been able to measure. You compare those measurements against what you're expecting. If enough of them are positive and none of them are negative, then you're sort of in the perimeter, to use the same language that we started with. Mm-hmm. Where it gets super interesting is when they conflict. And how do you deal with that? And then whether or not you want to have bright lines. So one of the bright lines that we referred to earlier was like, this resource is available only to devices that are within our control. Or this resource is available only to people who have properly authenticated. And those could be exclusive bright lines, or they could be overlapping bright lines. Mm-hmm. But the key is like, there's no longer a perimeter, or even a whole bunch of perimeters. There's a much more complex set of decisions that need to get made. And then it's incumbent on us to actually, monitor that and update it from time to time.
So I would let's push on that notion that on Adrian's notion that there isn't any perimeters or even multiple perimeters. Is there a better word? I think I see in some of the comments someone asking if that's not an appropriate analogy. Is there a better analogy that helps us understand the complexity of what we're dealing with?
I think if we offer to simplify it, we will lose these different things that we want to protect here, which are looking at device data, looking at the human data, looking at the application data. So I don't know if it's if we need to have a new word, but just make sure that we're looking at all of these different attributes of what constitutes a perimeter. But open it up for discussion.
Yeah, I think that I don't think that I think we misuse perimeter as opposed to perimeter being like the fundamentally wrong concept to exist, right? So I think a lot of times we conflate defining the perimeter with defining the attributes of trust required to gain access to a thing, right? And one of the problems with how we misuse perimeter is we draw it too broad. We say like the enterprise perimeter, right? That's so broad that it has zero possible meaning. That's like saying I have a perimeter to a physical place, and then I have 50,000 doors all around the perimeter, each of which gives access in different ways. There's no perimeter at that point. There's just a collection of doors. But if you draw the perimeter tighter, right, around a specific resource or pool of data or vendor access or tool, then I think you can reasonably start to use the perimeter concept. And then segment that from here's my defined perimeter, right? Or sort of trust boundary is probably the other sort of old school word I would use in this context. This is my trust boundary. To cross this trust boundary, you must be at least this far on my trust spectrum, right? And I think that is a useful way to define perimeter and use perimeter or trust boundary or whatever you want to use.
Yeah, I mean, I think trust boundary is old, but that's okay. Because I think it definitely gets at the idea that you have lots of internal boundaries as well, whereas perimeter doesn't, or it sort of simplifies it.
And Philip, your last example of vendor access, for us, we started almost like customers were focused on employees and then on the programmatic, which I think we'll talk about application access, and then I think it was, wait a minute, what about these third parties that are poking a hole in my perimeter and coming in? So I agree with you that it has to be a wider way to scope all of these potential assets or elements that can have access.
So I'm going to push again because I think terminology is a huge deal for me. Whether you call it a perimeter or a boundary, it's still something that surrounds an asset of interest. And the problem that I have with the notion of an identity-centric perimeter is we don't really define what kind of identity we're referring to. And I think the conversation that we're having is to say, well, that identity is made up of many different types of attributes: device-centric, application-centric, user-centric, even network-centric still, right? And for us to be very deliberate in saying, here are the different types of perimeters that we can now count on or should leverage or account for in terms of establishing greater and greater levels of trustworthiness. Let's at least know that they exist and not just think a user-centric identity perimeter is going to be sufficient, because we all know it's not, right?
Yeah. So at Atlassian, one of the things that we laid out as a goal was for every access to data, we need to know who, as in the person, is doing it. We need to know where they're doing it from. We need to know what hardware they're using to make that connection. And then we need to know what protocols are authorized to make that connection. And if any of those things fails, it needs to be a reliable, secure protocol. If any of those fails, then that access is refused. And our goal is to make sure that we have that in place everywhere. And then for each one of those elements of identity over time, we're trying to expand the strength with which we have the assertion. So maybe for some things right now, it's okay to say username, password. But in the long run, that's not going to be acceptable, right? Username, password has all kinds of problems within it. So it'll all be 2FA. And then it shouldn't even be weak 2FA. It should be strong 2FA, et cetera, et cetera. And so we build those up over time. But I think anything that doesn't take into consideration at least those 4 different attributes has catastrophic failure cases that are sort of unrecoverable. And so that's how we've been approaching it.
And I think, Adrian, you mentioned earlier, what do you do when indications conflict? And here again, new technology gives us an opportunity with adaptive authentication, where you can challenge the person again. You can run analytics on processes. In our world, we started with privileged access management, and about 2 months ago we acquired Idaptive out of California, which is an IDaaS platform. And what excited us the most was their approach to we have to continuously run analytics and be able to challenge that. It's not enough to start a session, but what's going on in the session, and do we want to challenge that as we go along, because of other conflicting data that's coming in.
So pointing to some of the commentary that I'm seeing from the audience, there's a concern that I think we need to be cognizant of around in terms of single points of failure that we're creating in some of these perimeters, and more specifically, application-centric identities. Let's say API keys, webhooks. That there was an example. There was a mention of the Twitter hack. And I don't want to speculate too much, but in some of the chatter amongst the attackers, they mentioned how they were able to compromise Twitter's Slack environment. And I wouldn't be surprised if that actually started from a leaked webhook or an API key that enabled an attacker to establish some sort of foothold. So API keys, and particularly their lack of governance, seems like a real weakness in our some of these new perimeters. Essentially, a single point of failure, if you will. Do you see it the same way? And if so, how might we shore up our defenses there?
I mean, I certainly do. I think API keys are something that often are hard-coded. They're often symmetric. They're often given to someone who, sets them up once, and then there's an expectation that they're going to continue using them for years and years and years, right? And we know that approach doesn't work, right? You need to build into your rotation. You need to make sure that the person receiving it can't actually compromise it or move it somewhere else. And so many of those flaws are the same ones that we've seen with passwords in the past, right? And sophisticated consumption of passwords at this point has it be just one of many factors. And a lot of those factors are sort of fed into a risk engine, and they look at where is it coming from, who's using it, what were the past use cases, what's the duration, is it being used simultaneously anywhere else, those kinds of questions. We don't see too many instances of API keys having that type of risk applied to them. We're starting to think about that. In fact, using just the same set of parameters. So you can see whether there's potential abuse or movement that's unexpected, and then figure out how to react to it. So I would expect that the same sort of patterns that we've established for other types of tokens would make a lot of sense. But I think that's a relatively new concern for people.
Yeah, it's a relatively new one. I think we saw that same concern about privileged access for humans expand to hard-coded credentials and classic type of keys, and now expanding to all sorts of keys that give programmatic access. In the case that we can do something to govern them and rotate them, and then we're actually achieving even more than what we can do with a human, because we're not disrupting and we're behind the scenes. In the case that we are not, and these are new type of entities, we can at least look for attempts for credential theft. And so we're trying to complement the controls with, is somebody trying to steal a credential in this environment?
Yeah, I think the hard thing about API keys for me is that there's such inconsistent controls around them. Because but sure, there's the case where you have internal API keys, but a lot of this stuff is external vendors. You mentioned Slack. I mean, there's probably hundreds in most modern enterprises. And they have different levels of granularity. You have different controls on can you bind an API key to an IP address? Can you not? What kind of logging do you get out of the service, et cetera? And it can be really hard to build an effective risk engine around that kind of third-party API usage, especially, and this is sort of magnified by the fact that a lot of critical data is in SaaS applications these days. We just can't get around the growth of that sector. And so it's for me, it's definitely an area of concern, and it's not one easily addressed because it's mostly in the realm of the vendors.
I think that's where the vendors have to step up.
Yes, I mean,
and have to be thinking about it as a risk to their business when somebody else's credentials get compromised, and sort of get ahead of their customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not going to be there. It's not going to be there until we as an industry are coming to them and they're seeing, hey, we're not able to land contracts because our OAuth or our permission scope is too coarse or whatever.
So to that end, so earlier we talked about needing or wanting to leverage multiple types of perimeters. My argument with API keys is we've now collapsed that to a single point of failure. What I heard from Philip is, let's say if you add in another a network-centric identity, let's say an IP address or an IP address range, you now have 2 points of failure, right? Potential points of failure. But ultimately, it's up to the vendors to enable us to leverage those additional types of perimeters. And I think, to your point, we don't have many vendors that give us that additional, the flexibility to be able to introduce additional perimeters that we can then count on to create those defenses.
Yeah, it could be that the sort of, to continue using the word, like the additional identities get exposed to a consumer, right? So, or it could be that they are silently managed and sort of implemented in place, right? So one debate for a vendor like Atlassian, where we're exposing cloud APIs, is, do we do IP-based whitelisting and then have the customer manage that for the plugins that are in their environment? Or do we say we're actually going to monitor everything and we're going to flag it and we're going to expose it and we're going to react when we see something that is not normal? And it may be that both are necessary, but I think in practice, relying on customers to do that doesn't scale very well.
I agree with that. It's a maturity thing, right? Like, not everyone's ready to be consuming that or reacting or using the whitelisting effectively. But at the same time, I think to your implied point, like, it doesn't scale necessarily for Atlassian to build out like some sort of insane API key usage monitoring system and service just because their customers can't use an IP whitelist, right? So I think we think about this in Coinbase, working with our customers as well, right? Because we expose API keys to businesses and consumers about, like, where's the balance, right? Where's sort of the responsibility sharing line between how much work we do versus how much our customers should be able to do themselves. It's tough.
No, it's a shared responsibility, and I suppose we just need the features to be able to leverage them if we choose to do so. And I think when it comes to SaaS in particular, we're starting to see this explosion of all these SaaS applications and movement among SaaS applications. And I think we as practitioners have difficulty establishing any kind of perimeter between them, right? And the best perimeter, the only perimeter, we have a lot of single points of failure in the API keys that we're granting between all these SaaS applications. And I think we just need better tools to be able to manage all those identities and those perimeters as well.
Plus, we have the humans accessing these, because again, back to Twitter. At the end of the day, there was some human admin console, again, according to what they published, that either could have been stronger in the program itself or required some other human oversight.
Well, with that, we are right at time. Thank you very much, Philip, Adrian, and Udi. I appreciate you guys having this very lively discussion. And with that, you guys have a good afternoon or evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.